I don't know as the moon had anything to do with it in the beginning. It sure as hell didn't mean much to me. I was happy as a pig just test flying jets. As for rockets, they weren't for flying, they were for fireworks. But it all changed pretty damn quick. We got into a race. Putting a man on a rocket became the most important thing in the world. And I figured it ought to be me. That's a test pilot's nature. He wants to be first. The finish line. That's what the moon was. A brand new runway. Fate, luck, the Russians, whatever it was, it put us in the spotlight. And flying the thing was only half the job. The other half was making it look easy. And that's the part no one saw. It was never easy, never safe, never routine. I guarantee you never heard the real story. It was a hell of a ride.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
That's me, Slayton, Major Donald K. Deke to my friends. It was 1957, and I thought I had the greatest job in the world. Test pilot. Then out of the blue, I got selected for some crazy experiment called Project Mercury. For me and 6 other pilots, it turned into the trip of a lifetime. Before it ended, one of us even walked on the moon. Some of it made the headlines, but to me, the best part never got told. I was in the middle of it all, from the very beginning to the end. Now I can finally tell it the way I saw it. I remember it as clear as yesterday. It's been a lot of years and a lot of miles since I met these guys, my friends and comrades. Al Shepard, John Glenn, Gordo Cooper, Scotty Carpenter. We started out with one thing in common. All we ever wanted to do was fly. Just a farm boy from Wisconsin, but I'd had flying on the brain since I was a kid. After the war, I found a way to keep going faster and higher. Test flying. Sure, it got a little hairy sometimes. Dealing with unknowns, things always go wrong. Anybody can get into trouble, but the best can get out. See, a test pilot with a problem doesn't think, I've got 10 seconds until I crash. He thinks, hell, I got 10 seconds. I bet I can save this thing. Well, maybe you can't, but you think you're the best, even if you die trying to prove it. Faster, farther, higher. That's test flying. Then overnight the game changed. Faster, farther, higher no longer meant wings and wheels. It meant rockets. Now there was a chance to fly into space and into history. We all wanted it. But out of hundreds of test pilots, it came down to 7 astronauts. And there was a lot more to being an astronaut than we realized, like press conferences. With so many to choose from, I figured these 7 would be the best damn test pilots in the country.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you,
But I looked around and I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought, either I don't belong here or some of these other guys don't.
Malcolm S. Carpenter.
Scotty was kind of a philosophical type, a bit of a poet. Not exactly the typical test pilot.
Leroy G. Cooper.
Gordo matched the basics, but I'd heard he was a real hot dog. Had a tendency to be a little flaky.
John H. Glenn.
John had gotten a lot of press for setting a cross-country speed record, but he was over age and he really didn't meet the education requirement.
Virgil I. Grissom.
Gus Grissom. Now here was a real test pilot. He'd flown in Korea and he was a damn good engineer. A little short, though.
Walter M. Shearer.
Wally was a real joker, and nobody enjoyed Wally's sense of humor more than Wally. But he was Navy, and I respect anyone who flies off carriers.
Alan B. Shepard.
Over the years, this guy, Shepard, would end up being my best friend. But then he was competition. I could tell he'd be the guy to beat.
Donald K. Slayton.
And of course me, the best of the seven. Wouldn't be a good test pilot if I wasn't sure of that.
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
I was happy I'd made it and ready to work. But why all the publicity? We hadn't done anything yet. And the questions had nothing to do with flying.
Why is it that family men were picked instead of bachelors? Don, as a bachelor, answer that, please.
Walt, the only thing I can say is that the medical statistics prove that married men live longer than bachelors. And
Here we were, military men, and they're asking us to get warm and personal.
The question is, what is the motivation of these men?
Oh, man, I wanted to be anywhere but there.
Okay, my full name is Donald K. Slayton, and my hometown is Sparta, Wisconsin. And my age is 35.
I was nervous as hell and a long way from smooth, but the guy next to me laid it right out.
I have no problems at home. My family's in complete agreement.
Well, there it was. Nobody was going to stop Al Shepard. But John Glenn understood that moment better than any of us. These people were looking for heroes, and John gave them just what they wanted.
I think we are very fortunate that we have, should we say, been blessed with the talents that have been picked for something like this. And I think we'd be almost remiss in our duty if we didn't make full use of our talents.
It was like he'd been cast for the role. John understood what the rest of us missed. America was in a Cold War. We seven were carrying the flag in a race with the Russians. A race that started with Sputnik. Sputnik, the first man-made object in orbit. If the Russians could put a satellite over our cities, then a bomb might be next.
Their own people, at 9:40, I believe it was, it passed over Detroit, and at 1 minute later, it passed over Washington. This is what 18,000 miles an hour is.
They do not tell the sober ramifications of what Russia has done for herself as a world power.
We've been operating since World War II under the illusion that this was basically a peacetime situation. This isn't peacetime. This is all-out war.
People were scared. If Russia could do it, why not us? What about an American rocket?
As of now, the United States is strong. Our scientists assure me that we are well ahead of the Soviets, both in quantity and in quality.
President Eisenhower was on the hot seat.
I ask you, sir, what are we going to do about it?
His answer was NASA, a program for manned space flight. That's where we came in. NASA needed pilots. The first word of mouth on Project Mercury made it sound pretty dumb.
I can recall my own reaction. What a bunch of idiots.
I have this big auditorium at the Pentagon with about 70 guys, 2 engineers and a shrink trying to tell us about how exciting it would be to get in a capsule on top of a rocket. And I said, where the hell's the no desk? And to make us feel better, they said, well, don't worry, we're going to send a chimpanzee first. Where the hell is the no desk?
But the more we heard about it, the better it sounded. Manned space flight. It just might work. And if it did, every one of us wanted that first ride, especially the guy sitting right next to me. Alan B. Shepard, son of a career military officer, Naval Academy graduate, test pilot, and husband of Louise. In the early days, all I knew about Al Shepard was that he was a hot jock in a test plane, on the fast track to Admiral stripes, and not a guy to stand in front of unless you're looking to get run over. In fact, I'm glad I wasn't around that Friday when Al read in the New York Times about Project Mercury and thought he'd been passed over.
Why am I not on the list of guys who have received telegrams? And I thought, certainly they could not have overlooked me, one of the great test pilots of the Navy. So I was in a terrible mood at the end of the day. Drove home, spent the weekend at Virginia Beach. My poor wife suffered. The children and the dogs and everybody felt the wrath of Shepard to some degree. I was still totally out of it when I went back to the office on Monday morning. And I was in the process of reading the New York Times again when a yeoman came in the office, said, Commander, this is a dispatch which came in Friday, and for some reason we didn't get it to you. Well, I looked at it, and I practically kissed the guy, because here was the invitation to go back to Washington to try out to become an astronaut.
But it was only an invitation to try out. Hundreds of pilots got them. Before anyone got selected, they had to go through testing the likes of which we'd never seen before.
Hey, which test they like least?
And it's rather difficult to pick one, because if you figure how many openings there are on the human body and how far you go in any one of them.
You gave it away.
Now you answer which one would be the toughest for you.
One of the worst tests that I ever experienced was the time when this wasn't even a doctor. He was just a corpsman of some sort. Put this needle in my hand here, this meaty part of my hand, and then put electricity into it, which balled up my hand and hurt like the devil. And then he was taking pictures on an oscilloscope up there, which the thing failed somehow. If they could smoked and everything like that. And so when my hand was balled up, he called up and wanted to get a TV technician to go fix the thing.
I see you brought your Air Force pressure suit with you.
Yes?
It doesn't look awfully comfortable.
It isn't. Sergeant Cusey, will you stand up and move around?
When they got done with our bodies, they started on our minds.
It is restricting to his mobility to some extent.
Dr. Garofal, I believe that Dr. Strughold referred to you as a psychologist.
That's right.
Now, isn't it rather surprising that a psychologist should be investigating a physical condition like weightlessness?
Every one of us that went in to see the psychiatrist, when we had those Rorschach tests, you know, and we were looking at nothing but a blank piece of paper.
And she gave me a sheet of white paper, and she said, well, what does that look like? And I said, oh, that's easy.
And he says, I want you to just look at this card and you visualize the story and then tell me what it is you see. And
I said, that's a blonde woman dressed in a white leotard on a white horse riding desperately through a snowstorm. It's not really. Where do you see that?
We always saw feminine attributes in there, feminine anatomy in there, only to show how masculine we were. And the psychiatrist thought we were all sex maniacs, but he passed us.
So I took hold of the thing, and then I turned it over, and I said, you gave it to me upside down, and that did it. I was over it right there.
Maybe subconsciously I was trying to not get into program.
We were well patients being looked at by sick doctors.
Hundreds were tested. Only 7 made it. But competing for the title astronaut was nothing compared to what was about to begin. The competition for the first ride and the title, First Man in Space. These guys look pretty tame now, sitting around chewing over old times. But I knew them back when being number one was all they lived for.
They were very competitive among each other because they each wanted to get the ride. You know, there was only so many people who could ride a Mercury spacecraft.
We worked as a team, but to get that first flight, we each had to prove we were tougher, smarter, and better prepared than the other 6.
All of a sudden now here you've got 7 guys trying to fly the same airplane. And boy, there was competition. And I think everyone sensed it in almost everything we did.
I remember one of the first meetings we ever had with Bob Gilruth, who ran the program at that time. He said we had enough doubts about the program. We could go back to our services where we had come from and no questions asked, and that was it. All we had to do is say the word. And of course, nobody ever did. We were fighting to get positions, not to go back someplace.
It was just a matter of personal pride to know that you were the best and that you were going to make the first flight.
There is rivalry, of course, but the Navy people were the best. There's no doubt about that. And the fact that we had 3 Air Force people with us was purely political, and 1 token Marine, which that's all right. The Marines are part of the Navy anyway.
In this group, if you had a weakness, you never let it show. I was doing great until Carpenter got a bright idea.
As I recall, it was at my suggestion that we took scuba training at Little Creek with the UDT fellow. Tough program. And they put us through some real paces.
We're sort of cavorting around this 9-foot deep pool, and all of a sudden we look, and here's Slayton down the bottom. The guy couldn't swim. Gus and I dive down and bring Deke up to the surface. They admitted Slayton was probably the best scuba diver of all, because he'd go to the bottom right away.
His wife, Marge, remarked that he had been home practicing in the kitchen sink, trying to inhale from his mouth and exhale through his nose in the water. But he did that whole training and didn't tell anybody that he didn't know how to swim.
Sure, it's funny now, but the pressure to perform was nonstop. We needed to let off a little steam. We weren't going to let the fact that we were astronauts keep us from having fun, but some of us had different definitions of fun.
I think while the other astronauts sometimes were a little bit more mischievous in things they did, and John stood out as the all-American boy in that particular group.
John Glenn didn't appreciate our kind of fun. One night he made that very clear.
Well, you know, frankly, when we were discussing extracurricular activities, if you will, I thought to myself, well, gosh, why is this even coming up? Why is it being discussed? Doesn't everyone have the right to do what they want to do?
John said, knock it off, kind of. You guys are having too much fun. John came down on us much like a mother hen, so we didn't like that too much.
I was afraid at that time that if there was any very severe publicity about the group, negative publicity, that it could affect the kind of support funding out of the Congress. It could really harm us somewhat. So I was a little bit concerned about it.
Extracurricular activities was a tempest in a teapot compared to the issue of who would fly first. When we finally heard, it was typical fighter pilots in a room, each convinced he's the best. But 6 of us got some very bad news.
We were asked by Bob Gilruth to stay on a little later than we normally would have.
We sat there in our magnificent office, 7 steel desks in one room, and waited and waited, and there wasn't a heck of a lot of conversation. No introductions, no pleasantries. He said, well, we've been watching you guys now for almost a couple of years.
And Bob didn't mince words. Said, Glenn, Grissom, and Shepard are selected for the first Redstone flight.
It turned out to be Al, and Gus was to get the second flight, and John was to be backup for both.
It was an emotional high because of those 7 equally qualified guys, I had been picked to make the first flight.
I can recall really feeling deflated, because this is one of those rare times when you didn't make the mark, or at least I hadn't. And here were Slayton, Carpenter, Cooper, and myself, second team. A very, very traumatic feeling.
Not being first was bad enough, but not even placing in the first 3. I couldn't believe it.
Of course, they all came forward and shook my hand and congratulated me, some with less enthusiasm than others.
It was time to put everything else aside and do the job. Al and his backup, John, got to work preparing for the flight. Al was ready to take his seat in the cockpit and his place in history. Unfortunately, the seat in the cockpit was temporarily occupied.
President.
Now
I guess this chimpanzee who was flying in space took off at 10:08. He reports that everything is perfect and working well.
At one point, there were something like 20 or 30 animal flights. So many that Bob Gilruth, the center director, suggested once we should move the program to the French Cameroons, where all the chimps live, and just launch there. Go out and pull one out of a tree and stick them in a capsule.
We found all the jokes real funny. Time to feed the chimp. Spam in a can. Shepard, Grissom, and Glenn, the link between monkey and man. But we hadn't signed on to fly standby while Bonzo pushed the outside of the envelope.
At one time with Al, he gave him a bunch of static, and I kind of mentioned to him, I said, Al, if you don't like it, we can go back to somebody who works for banana peels. And he kind of threw an ashtray at me at that time.
Chimps don't talk back, test pilots do. We knew until we were flying, the program and our lives would be out of our control. We'd seen enough monkey business and we were ready to go. Then the last chimp flight before Al had a problem. And Werner von Braun, our German rocket genius, wanted one more test.
The escape tower fired, but it stayed hooked on to the capsule. So the monkey got a lot higher and a lot further than he should have gone. And we said, well, heck, we know what happened. They figured out which switch it was. We said, we're ready to go. You remember all that discussion? They said, let's go.
But the extra test delayed the schedule. The first man in space wouldn't be named Al or Gus or John or even Deke. It would be Yuri Gagarin, a Russian cosmonaut.
I'll never forget Al's reaction. He said, look at that goddamn thing, and he hit his hand so hard I thought he was going to break it.
The public didn't like losing to a Russian any more than Al did.
It means they're getting ahead of us, and we certainly need to start working hard to catch up.
I think it's about time America woke up and did something about it.
The Russians were beating us. NASA was dragging its heels. We were starting to look bad.
And may I ask what that's called? Is that the crash helmet?
Oh, I hope not.
After you leave the moon, sir, when you come back to Earth, where will you be landing?
I am going to be landing in Nevada.
Mm-hmm. In the state of Nevada?
In the state of Nevada, yes.
Then you're convinced that they will get you back to Earth?
I am convinced that they will get me back to Earth. Just how far into it? That's what I'm not convinced about.
Well, surely they've provided something to break your fall.
Oh, yes, the state of Nevada.
But Al Shepard was no reluctant astronaut. He couldn't wait to be the first American in space. It takes a whole lot of people to build a new flying machine, but when it's finally ready, only one climbs into the cockpit. Now the world could only watch. America was taking its first step toward the moon. Alan B. Shepard was about to ride the rocket.
Early in the morning of
Alan's flight, I went into the crew quarters and awakened him, and he's calm, cool, and collected. I was scared to death. In contradistinction to Alan, I was probably the most frightened person on the pad, because this was a friend of mine, a close, near and dear friend of mine, who was putting his life on the line.
I was aware only of the people around me. The medics who were going to pat me on the head and finally let us go fly.
On the surface, it wasn't going to be much of a flight. A suborbital, we called it. Just 15 minutes from launch till splashdown. But it was 15 minutes of pure unknowns. The launch, the G-forces, re-entry. Any one of them could kill Al. He may have been cool, but the rest of us were more than a little nervous.
I have seen people throw up on the launch consoles in the blockhouse because no one wanted to be responsible for a hold or responsible for any kind of a mess up.
When the Russians flew Gagarin, they kept it a secret until he was back safe. But Al Shepard was going to make it or break it on live TV in front of millions.
The 33-ton rocket is poised to hurl America's first man into space at 5,000 miles per hour. Alan Shepard will rocket to 115 miles above the Earth. He will weigh nearly 1,000 pounds from the punishing acceleration of his giant booster rocket.
And you know the old desire of all pilots that when you walk up to the airplane, you always kick the tires just to be sure they're not flat. This particular rocket I was never going to see again, so I just stopped as I approached it, looked up into the glare of the spotlights, and took a look at the rocket. Sort of another way of kicking the tires, so to speak.
All of a sudden you realize, hey, wait a minute. The next one that we launch, it better not get blown up, because there's somebody in you know. It's not just some monkeys, chimps, but it's a man.
People have always said, how does it feel to be in a history book? And I said, listen, when you're sitting on the top of some 6 million pounds of high explosive fuel, the last thing in your mind is being a page in a history book.
The countdown dragged on and on. Waiting wasn't easy for any of us, but it was worse for the man locked in the can.
I can't hear you on this goddamn. Hear you on this phone.
Hey, watch your language. We're being recorded every place.
We are standing by to resume the count.
Reporters, photographers, and technicians here are more excited than fans.
The rocket is poised and ready. Shepard is ready. The missile range and recovery forces are ready.
The 83-foot tall Mercury Redstone rocket with astronaut Alan Shepard aboard. He's been there several hours now. Up on top.
Al was beginning to wish he hadn't had that second cup of coffee.
I soon discovered that the bladder was getting relatively full, and I said, well, why don't you ask Werner if I can open the door and get out and go to the bathroom, like a normal person would. And I expected a normal answer. Werner says, no, the astronaut will stay in the nose cone. There will be no door opening. So I told the folks that I was going to relieve myself on the spot, and they said, oh, you can't do that. You short-circuit everything. Well, I said, well, how about turning the power off? So they deliberated a few more minutes and finally turned off the power. I relieved myself, and it started to dry out, so I said, okay, I think you guys can turn the power back on, and we'll take the risk of a shock. I finally said, well, I'm getting tired of this. Why don't you tell them to light this damn candle, because I'm ready to go.
T-minus 10, 9, 8,
Now he was on his own. After years of getting ready, there was nothing we could do but wait.
Main chute is green. Main chute is coming unraised, and it looks good.
This is it. He's on the way down.
At about this time.
You should hear the newsmen here right now. They are absolutely screaming and shouting. They've been jumping up and down, holding their hands over their head in a great sign of victory because this flight is just about at its end. It is a tremendously successful thing. They're kissing each other and hugging and jumping up and down. I take any second. Astronaut Shepard will be walking on the deck of the aircraft carrier, and we will have completed a most historic event in the history of man's conquest of new frontiers.
Then as we're flying toward the carrier, and the entire deck of the carrier was covered with sailors. The deck was just covered with these guys. The fact that the carrier had been my home, part of my life. The sailors had been part of my life. And here were these guys, the first guys to welcome me back. This was the first sense which I had of how people felt about what I had done. That had to have been the most emotional carrier landing which I ever made.
This is the beginning of a fantastic new age when two nations are marching into space in a competition with one another. America has finally forged back tremendously in this particular shot.
Gus and I met Al after the flight. It felt good. I wanted that first ride myself. Hell, each of us did. And we knew the Russians were still way ahead. But Al was one of our own. And he'd put us in the game.
We were there because that was what we were trained to do. We were test pilots.
But we'd become more than test pilots. Now we were astronauts. When test pilots risk their lives, it's a 9-to-5 job, and hardly anybody notices. But the Mercury astronauts had an audience of millions. We all knew getting that first flight would make Al a big man, but we had no idea how big.
Back to Washington for this parade, and we were down there, and I remember we were all sort of wide-eyed about it, just like the excitement of the crowd and everybody when we were in the parade just sort of washed over you.
The crowd behind us has just now caught a glimpse of Alan Shepard, and you can hear what they're doing about it.
I understand Mr. Shepard is a retiring man, doesn't like to make public appearances, doesn't mind being lofted into space, but doesn't like to make public appearances.
Here at the White House Rose Garden, the entire staff of the White House has come out to get a look at this first spaceborne astronaut of the United States.
I thought that last Friday was a thrilling day. Today even surpasses last Friday. And as a matter of fact, I got far less sleep last night than I did the night before the flight. Thank you very much.
As Kennedy made his little speech, as he got ready to present me with the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, it slipped off the box onto the deck, onto the floor. Jack Kennedy came up with the medal first, and he said, "Shepard," he says, "I present you this medal which comes to you from the ground up," which was a great line. Kennedy insisted prior to the parade that we return to the Oval Office for a meeting. He said, "This is fantastic. What you've done is absolutely fantastic. What do you guys have planned for the future?" And then he said, "I want a briefing on this." And it was just 3 weeks after my 16-minute space flight when he announced, "Folks, we're going to go to the moon, and we're going to do it before the end of the decade."
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single...
When I remember hearing the speech and thinking to myself, my God, we have hardly begun to walk here, and this going to the moon is a tremendous step.
Everybody in the community thought he was nuts. He said that 20 days after Al Shepard flew in May, and we hadn't even put anybody in orbit yet.
Daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation. For all of us must work to put him there.
Al's flight made a believer out of Kennedy, and that speech gave the whole country moon fever. All over America, people went to work on the moon shot.
I don't know if anybody was a clock puncher. No matter what role they played, that was in the back of their mind. We've got that man to get to the moon.
We practically had a big sign chiseled in the sky up there that said, "Waste anything but time."
It was a matter of 5 to 20 insurmountable problems a day.
We were literally writing the book as we went along.
Working around the clock was our only hope. Feeling good about Al's flight didn't change the facts. It had taken us 3 years to get into space for all of 16 minutes. Now we had less than a decade to get to the moon. There was a lot of hard work going on in those days, but that wasn't all that was going on.
Oh, and I remember another classic episode where we water skied in the surf, being pulled by a tow to a Chevy, a Corvette, right.
Over the years, the military had assigned us to some of the most godforsaken spots on Earth. And at first, Cocoa Beach was no different. But once Kennedy pointed us at the moon, Cocoa Beach, Florida became Spaceport USA. We thought we'd died and gone to heaven.
Cocoa Beach was a wild place. It was a wide open, raucous, frontier type existence.
It was boomtown. Lots of pretty girls and lots of heroic men and abandon.
It was like having magic Goofus dust placed on your shoulder when they hung that title astronaut on you.
There were women on the beach. They were there to have the attention of an astronaut. They wanted to befriend another astronaut. And, you know, I used to say, well, they've got astronaut poisoning.
There were ladies in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and probably other places around the country who liked to brag about how many or which different astronauts they had managed to slip into their bed. If they only knew that it wasn't all that difficult, then they probably wouldn't have bragged that much.
It's just unbelievable. And no one ever said a word. No one. It never got into the press, and no one ever said a word.
No matter how hard we partied, we couldn't keep the damn moon off our minds for long. All you had to do was step outside and take a look. There it was, waiting. We had to keep moving. Now we had two priorities. Prove that Al's success wasn't just dumb luck, and get every Mercury pilot some spaceflight experience. Gus Grissom had won the second ride. We still didn't have a rocket with enough power to get into orbit, so Gus would make another suborbital flight just like Al's. Al's flight was perfect. Gus was out to do even better. Just because Al survived his flight didn't mean the next one would be a ride in the park. Gus knew the risks as well as anyone.
For some reason, somebody decided they wanted to put a parachute in the cabin, so I was talking to Gus about it. I said, okay, we'll get it put in. I said, but I don't think it'll do you any good. I don't think you can get it on. And his retort was, well, it'll give me something to do until I hit.
We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have ignition. We have liftoff.
Gus flew a perfect flight, but after he splashed down, the hatch blew. The capsule filled with water and sank to the bottom. He almost drowned.
I was just laying there minding my own business, and then pow! The hatch went. I looked up and I saw nothing but blue sky and water starting to come in over the sill. So I tossed my helmet off. My first thought was, get out. And the capsule actually sank and went below the water. And he was having difficulty getting the capsule out of the water. He couldn't lift it. He ran into an engine problem. And so I was getting water in the suit and getting lower and lower in the water all the time. I was having to fight quite hard to stay afloat.
Instead of a Washington parade, Gus got a lot of questions he didn't like having to answer.
Captain Griffin, did you feel you were in danger when you were in the water or any time during the flight?
Well, I was scared a good portion of the time. I guess this is a pretty good indication.
You were what?
Scared. Okay?
There it was. He said it out loud. He was scared. Of all the feelings astronauts weren't supposed to show, fear was number one. We knew he didn't blow the hatch, but there was no stopping the rumors now. But Gus's flight wasn't all we had to worry about. We hadn't even orbited yet, and the Russians sent up their second orbital flight.
Newspaper headlines tell the story. Herman Titov of Russia returns to Earth after orbiting the globe 17 times in a little more than 25 hours, covering 435,000 miles, which is more than twice the distance from the Earth to the Moon. An orbit by a U.S. astronaut is planned later this year.
Later this year, the same old story. Russians in the lead and we're dragging. It was getting to be a habit with us. The embarrassing truth was, we weren't going anywhere near Earth orbit this year or any year. Not until we had a new booster. The Redstone we were flying was reliable as hell, but it didn't have enough power. There was no way around it. To reach the moon meant reaching orbit. The only thing we had to do that was Atlas. And Atlas was one bad news booster. This was the only rocket we had to get into orbit. And this was the man who was going to ride it.
And so one day I ran into this thing, I think it was in Reader's Digest, and I came in and put it up on the blackboard in the room that we all shared. And it was definition of a sports car, an emotional hedge against the male menopause. There's a brand new bunch of astronauts, and we're going to go down. This is supposed to be a big confidence builder to let us see a big booster take off. So we go down, and it's a beautiful, clear, starry night. And so this thing lights off, and the hold down bars pull back, and the thing starts up, and so theatrical anyway. Just the nature of it looks like it was staged by Hollywood or by Disney or somebody, you know, with the searchlights, and it's quite impressive. And we're watching the thing go, and up it goes, and we're watching it hit the high Q point up there, and instead of going on through it like it was supposed to, it blew. And it looked like an atomic bomb went off right over us. So we all look at each other, you know, and that's the thing we're supposed to ride, you know. So we had a few discussions with the engineers after that. So they went back, and in fact, Deke was the one who followed, in particular, the booster problems that we were having.
Problems like that, I didn't have to follow too close. I could see them from the next state. But we were in a race, and the other side was winning. Underneath our astronaut exteriors, we were still fighter pilots. NASA could worry about the Atlas till the cows come home. To us, the situation was pretty damn simple. There was a mission to be flown. It was dangerous. If John didn't make it, there'd be 6 of us left. And don't kid yourself. As soon as the funeral was over, we'd be lining up to take the next ride. That's the test business.
The capsule will be hurtled into the heavens by a mighty Atlas rocket. A failure in any one of the thousands of parts of the rocket could mean death for the red-headed test pilot who volunteered for space flight because of the challenge.
John Glenn was about to ride the Atlas, a rocket that had a nasty habit of blowing up. But we had an appointment with the moon.
3, 2, 1, 0. Good Lord, ride all the way. Godspeed, John Glenn.
All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff.
The Atlas missile has lifted off from the pad and is rising steady into the sky. And John Glenn, Jr. has begun his first orbital ride around the Earth.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
They were so concerned that you not be distracted by other things that the original plan was that I would not even take a camera along. I thought this was getting to be a little ridiculous, and I said, look, I'm going up on this thing, and this is going to be a new view of things, and I think we at least ought to have a camera on this.
Friendship 7, Bermuda has you. Roger, Bermuda, stand by. This is Friendship 7.
The first orbit was beautiful. Then John started going on and on about something outside his window, and we started wondering if there was a screw loose up in the spacecraft.
This is Friendship 7. I am in a big mass of some very small particles that are brilliantly lit up like they're luminescent.
George Ruff, who was the psychiatrist that followed us around in those early days, and George sat in the back of the room, and I was describing these very seriously and talking about them, and George cocked his head and said, "And what did they say, John?"
15 minutes later, we all stopped laughing.
Go ahead, Jim. Roger, you do have a valid impact bag signal up at this time. A valid what?
A light in mission control said John's heat shield was loose. At 17,000 miles an hour, when he re-entered, the friction would heat the capsule to 3,000 degrees. Without that shield, he was a dead man.
This is Al Shepard. Yeah, we want to be damn sure on this one.
We've been talking about it on the ground for a long time. You didn't know anything was going on up there. And I was Capcom. And it was my job to tell you what we were, that your heat shield was loose and might fall off. You remember that one?
I remember very well, and you sort of talked around it a little bit about what is your indication of this switch, and you have this warning light, and I knew from the questions only one thing that could be indicated. And then finally, a decision was made to leave it on and make the re-entry with the retro pack.
This is Friendship 7. What is the reason for this? Do you have any reason? Over. Not at this time.
All we could do was tell him not to jettison his retro pack. There was a chance it might keep the heat shield on and keep John alive.
Go ahead, Cape. You're going out.
John was hitting the atmosphere. Now the heat began. If he was going to burn alive, it would happen in the next 5 minutes, but we wouldn't know till it was over. The same friction that might kill him also blocked all radio signals. We could only wait and hope and keep listening.
7, this is Cape. Transmitting blind. Keep talking, Al?
Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over.
Main shooters on green. Shooters out in reef condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful shoot.
When we finally heard his voice, he sounded like a kid on Christmas morning.
On O2 emergency and the shoot looks very good.
If John had died, the whole program might have died with him. But he didn't, and now he was a made man. The Navy sent a chopper to pick him up, but he didn't really need it. At that point, John Glenn could have walked on water.
The man who conquered outer space makes a new conquest as he takes New York by storm.
Al's reception had been big, but this was unbelievable. John's flight moved people. It was almost scary. This PR thing had grown into something a lot bigger than any of us, or NASA, or even the politicians had bargained for.
Down at his feet. The president stays on the sidelines as Mrs. Kennedy and high-flying Glenn practically go into orbit aboard water skis.
Old John was always sharp about stuff the rest of us barely thought of. Now he set his sights on a whole new orbit. 1962, 3 years since I'd joined the program. I'd been poked and prodded by doctors, paraded around for the press and politicians. I'd mastered every simulator, passed every test. Deke Slayton's time had finally come. The next flight was mine.
Is that your capsule sitting back there?
Oh, yes, it is.
How do you feel about it being out in the elements here this afternoon?
Oh, I don't mind it being in the elements if somebody was working on it.
You're raring to go.
Yes, sir.
You're damn right I was raring to go. John Glenn had taken us into orbit, and just surviving it was so remarkable it made him a legend. Now I was going to do it again and prove that the remarkable could become routine. And if I say so myself, I was the best pilot for the job.
He just was a pilot's pilot. He just loved to fly. He'd rather fly. If he couldn't fly, he'd die.
And then the worst thing I could ever imagine happened. I was grounded.
This is a diagnosis of paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. The only decision that has been made is that Deke will not take the next mission in the MA-7.
An irregular heartbeat. I'd had it for years and nobody blinked. Now, just months before my flight, NASA got nervous. If anything went wrong, they didn't want to look bad. I was grounded.
Feeling going to go average. Damn disappointed.
They can't do this to me. I mean, he kept saying that over and over again. They can't do this to me. This isn't fair. He was very, very, very upset and very angry and very hurt because this career meant so much to him. To be an astronaut meant so much to him.
I tried everything. Quit smoking, quit coffee, started jogging my ass off. The whole deal stunk. But I figured it was temporary. I'd get the next flight. But for Wally Schirra, things were looking up. He was my backup. He thought.
I was off on a trip somewhere. I remember I flew back into Langley in one of our planes, probably a 102, and landed and came by Scott Carpenter and Reen Carpenter's quarters, and my wife was there and the rest of the gang. And as I drove up my little flashy yellow Healy, Scott came out before I even got to join the group and said, Wally, we got a problem. Deke's grounded. Immediately I thought, oh, God, it's my flight. And Scott looked at me and said, no, it's not your flight, as if he read my mind. He said, it's my flight, and you'll be my backup. Thud. Another shot in the rear end.
I was disappointed for Deke, but that is in the conventional medical wisdom of the time. That was the decision that NASA made. They gave it to me because I had been so busy with John's flight that they figured I was in better shape to do it.
So instead of Wally Schirra, precision test pilot, we ended up with someone completely different.
Scott is a unique person. He's different. Not only different from the other astronauts, but different from all the other people in the world.
NASA saw the job as pure flight test. Evaluate the spacecraft and come home, nothing more. Scotty marched to a different drummer.
I was more interested in learning about what was there than I was in learning about what got us there. The engineering test pilot flies just to evaluate his machine. That has to be done. But my drummer told me that this is a marvelous opportunity to look at the space environment.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I feel the liftoff. The clock has started.
From the moment he lifted off, Scott wanted to report the feeling, the human experience of being in space.
Some beautiful cloud patterns down there. I seem to be much closer to the Earth than I expected to be.
Scott was like Mr. Wizard up there. He wanted to understand the unknowns of space, like John Glenn's fireflies.
It's hard to realize this now. There were so many unknowns in the early days. And this is a fact of the matter. We were really not sure after John flew whether or not there were critters, living critters out there somewhere.
I have the fireflies, almost like a light snowflake particle.
Scott figured out the fireflies were really wastewater from the capsule. Astronaut pee-pee.
Those fireflies weren't fireflies.
No, they weren't. They weren't fireflies. It was a constellation, you're right.
Well, that mystery was solved. But Scotty's experiments wasted fuel and took his mind off flying.
Some appear to glow, but I don't believe they really do.
A test pilot who gets distracted can wind up dead. In mission control, Chris Kraft was ready to blow a fuse.
He was in a mess with trying to determine what the hell the fireflies were that Glenn had seen. He wasn't in the right attitude in the spacecraft, and he had not gone through the checklist required to get ready for retrofiring.
I think I'm going to have to go to fly-by-wire and use the window and the scope.
Scott was 3 seconds late firing his retro rockets. At the speed he was going, 3 seconds late meant he'd land hundreds of miles off course. But even worse, he was out of fuel.
There was a flaming piece coming off. Almost looked like it came off the tower. Oh, I hope not.
No fuel. No way to steer. If the angle of re-entry was off, he'd burn alive.
I do remember thinking maybe I won't make it, and this is really tight, but thinking to myself, I ought to be worried about this, but I really am not. And I thought at that time, I feel almost like I'm somewhere else looking at this situation, interested but not involved. And I thought, isn't that handy?
This is Mercury Control. We are still attempting to reestablish contact with the Aurora 7 spacecraft.
For 40 minutes, the world waited to hear if Scott was dead or alive.
Our data at this time indicates that it is distinctly possible that the Aurora 7 spacecraft may land considerably longer downrange than it was planned.
The ship started coming in, and there he is, blithely outside. I can't believe it. And perfectly under control. What's wrong? I'm here. And that was Scott.
I understand the report came from Hawaii that it was a tired and confused astronaut. If my opinion is worth anything to you, this is not true. I will admit to being preoccupied.
It was uncanny luck that he survived. And he's goddamn lucky that it didn't come down bass backwards, because it could have. Somebody was looking out for him.
I didn't realize that people thought I was lucky to make it through. I really never felt that it had been that tight. But that's the sort of thing you have to face whenever you do new things that have never been done before. There are a lot of different masters to serve. I was listening to another drummer where my interest in science was concerned in the flight.
You know, Scotty probably got more out of that one flight than all the rest of us put together. But NASA wasn't paying us to be human. They wanted astronauts to keep their feelings to themselves, do the job and make it look easy. Scott got the standard hero's welcome, but NASA made sure he never flew again.
The Russians chalk up another victory in the space race as they put two manned spacecraft into orbit within 24 hours of each other.
Two spacecraft up at once, within sight of each other. That might mean rendezvous. And rendezvous was a big step toward the moon.
Tracking stations indicate that there is little doubt of the success of the Russian feat that is seen as 2 years ahead of the U.S. effort.
Now the Russians were flying for days at a time. We could only manage a few hours. After nearly losing Scott Carpenter, the program had to regain credibility. On our next flight, we had to perform better and stay up longer. And Wally Schirra was the guy to do it.
I have liftoff, watch it started. As he feels real nice.
Typical Wally. He cut out every science experiment he could. He had one goal, to fly the perfect mission.
Oh, she's riding beautiful, Deke.
And he did it, a textbook flight. But the world hardly noticed. Wally had splashed down in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought it home. Before cosmonauts and astronauts, the original payloads were nuclear warheads. Now we were eyeball to eyeball.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
Luckily for us, the Russians blinked. They took their missiles home. At least for now, life and the space race would go on.
Do you recognize this man? He's astronaut Alan Shepard, America's first man in space.
America had space fever. The Mercury 7 were the biggest celebrities around, and we knew it. NASA needed us, and we never let them forget it. We'd become much more than test pilots. We were carrying the image of the whole space program on our shoulders.
I remember thinking in the early days what a force we could be within NASA if we all presented a unified stand. And it occurred to me that we were the most powerful entity within NASA, and that NASA had a tiger by the tail in this group of 7 astronauts.
NASA was beginning to wish we were a little less famous and a lot easier to control. They decided they'd bring in a chaperone, some Army general, to make us toe the line. Well, that went over like a turd in a punch bowl. Then somebody had a bright idea.
We began to think, do we want an outsider to do this, or should we have one of us do it? And that's when the 7 of us got together and decided we better have Deke do this.
The 6 of them wanted to put me in charge of the astronaut office. The guys were kind of throwing me a bone and solving their astronaut boss problem, all in one neat package. But if the Mercury 6 thought I was going to be a rubber stamp boss, they were in for a surprise.
They thought with Deke that he would simply be the Wisconsin farm boy that would come in and sort of a figurehead. But they didn't know what a manager and what type of a person Deke Slayton was, what a doer he was. He wound up selecting the crews.
I didn't want the job I had, but I was going to do it the best way I could. And sure enough, I got tested right off the bat. Gordo Cooper was going to wrap up the Mercury program with our most daring flight yet, 36 hours in space. It was 4 times longer than we'd ever flown, and a lot longer than the Mercury spacecraft was originally meant to fly. So Gordo had a little fun with the name. He called it Faith 7. NASA wasn't amused. Gordo had a habit of stepping on NASA's toes. Nobody questioned his ability, just his judgment. Typical Gordo. 2 days before his flight, he came roaring in low over the launch complex, practically scared the pants off the flight director, Walt Williams.
He showed unusually bad judgment in that he flew at a low altitude close to the administration building. So low, in fact, that when Walt Williams looked out the window, here's this jet streaking by below his altitude.
I lit the afterburner right over the top of the hangar. Yeah. Then he went back to headquarters, he called me up and he said, "Shepard, is your suit ready?" And I said, "What do you mean? Of course my suit's ready." He says, "Well, I'm pulling Gordo off the flight, you're going."
Walt was dead serious about replacing Cooper with Shepard. And he'd have done it too, except it wasn't his job anymore, it was mine. And even though he got carried away, I knew pulling Gordo off that flight would kill his astronaut career. I wasn't going to do that.
Roger, have a lift off and the clock is operating. Take my 7, phase 7 on the way.
Gordo's flight went perfect for the first 30 hours. Then all of a sudden, the man in the can had some real work to do.
Wonder if you'd relay to the Cape little situation I had up and see what they think on it.
System by system, the spacecraft started dying. Autopilot dead, attitude readings dead, electrical systems all dead.
Well, things are beginning to stack up a little. ASCS inverter is acting up. And my CO2 is building up in the suit. Standby inverter won't come on the line. And other than that, things are fine.
About the only thing still working up there was Gordo. But he was about to attempt a completely manual re-entry, something no one had ever done before.
I'm looking for lots of experience on this flight. He's gonna get it.
He'd only get one chance. If he was off, he'd burn alive. Everything that should have been automatic, he had to do himself. All he had was a wristwatch on his arm for timing, eyeballs on the horizon for alignment, and finger on the button to fire his retro rockets. And he did it perfect. Right on the old bazoo, the Oklahoma hot dog landed closer to the carrier than anyone else. Gordo's performance was the ultimate proof of how well a man can fly a spacecraft. Why you needed men there in the first place.
One of the things which warmed us the most during this flight was the realization that however extraordinary computers may be, that we are still ahead of them, and that man is still the most extraordinary computer of all.
Project Mercury ended on a great note, and John Kennedy seemed to be as pleased as we were. He came down to the Cape to have a look at the huge new Saturn booster they were building for the moonshots, his baby. It was November 18th, 1963.
Kennedy put his hands in his coat pocket and leaned back on the heels and looked up to that huge first stage of Saturn. And I could just see in his eyes that he just loved the whole thing. This was romance. This was out there with Alexander the Great and Napoleon.
The conquest of space must and will go ahead. That much we know. That much we can say with confidence.
He gave a speech, and it was the story of these two boys and how they would go across the Irish countryside, and when they ran into a fence or an obstacle.
And when they came to an orchard wall that seemed too high and too doubtful to try,
one of the boys would grab the other's hat and throw it over the wall, and then they would have to climb the wall to retrieve the cap. Kennedy's analogy was, we have thrown our cap over the wall. We're going for it.
This nation has tossed its cap over the wall of space, and we have no choice but to follow it.
And then the next day, of course, he was dead, killed.
There has been a shooting. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
A priest has been ordered. Emergency supplies of blood also being rushed to the hospital.
The President of the United States is dead.
Terrible news. But I got to tell you, after the shock, my first thought was, what will this do to the program? I knew we'd lost a big fan.
It was my feeling that he was really a space cadet because he was excited about what men had done and could do in space.
We were his favorites. We were part of his little group, and all of us felt very comfortable with the President of the United States, like he was a buddy.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
Lyndon Johnson. If there was a bigger fan of space than Kennedy, it had to be old Lyndon. But now with Kennedy gone, meeting his deadline meant more than ever. We felt like we owed it to him. The program was really gearing up. Now, with Mercury over, we entered the next phase, Project Gemini.
Mr. Neil A. Armstrong, Air Force Major Frank Borman.
The Gemini 9, rookies here to make their mark. The Mercury guys welcomed them with all the warmth of a pit bull on a short leash.
It was more than competitive. It was psychological. It was, well, we're anointed, you're not, you got to pay your dues. I mean, these weren't expressed, and it wasn't written in any order. I have never seen a group of people stiff-arm another group like that.
The 9 looked up to the 7 as more or less their mentors, and probably the 7 said, hey, we can handle all this ourselves. Why do we need these 9 guys?
The fact was, we did need these new guys. The new Gemini program had to test and prove every technique we would need to reach the moon.
Project Gemini, a step which will
Could we maneuver spacecraft with precision? Could we rendezvous and dock 2 ships together? Could our bodies and our minds survive 14 days of weightlessness, the length of time a trip to the moon would take? And could we leave the safety of the spacecraft to walk and work in space? If we failed any one of these, we weren't going to the moon. 2 test pilots in a Gemini capsule was going to be a tight fit. We could really have used an extra room just for their egos.
When we started flying spacecraft with more than one person in it, obviously we had to have titles for the people. The natural title would be pilot and co-pilot. No one in the astronaut corps wanted to be called a co-pilot, so scratching their heads, management came up with commander and pilot.
There was no debate about who would command the first Gemini mission. It was Al Shepard all the way, America's first man in space. I wouldn't have it any other way. God knows neither would Al.
We had been training, I guess, perhaps a couple of months, and got up one morning, walking to the bathroom, and all of a sudden I totally lost my balance. It was almost as if I was spinning. Of course I wasn't, but I steadied myself and thought, well, gosh, I didn't really drink that much last night.
An inner ear problem, Meniere's disease. It knocked Al flat on his butt and right off flight status. Dizzy spells, disorientation. He wasn't flying anywhere.
Well, after the initial shock wore off, the initial shock, of course, was total disbelief that they could ground the best pilot they ever had. I told him I'd been flying fighter planes and I'd been a test pilot all of my life, and I'd fire the damn thing upside down, right side up, didn't make any difference to me.
He was grounded. I knew if Al couldn't fly, he'd go nuts being on the sidelines. So I asked him to join me running the astronaut office until he could get the medics off his back. Al and I were both out. The original 7 were down to 5, and then we lost another.
Is there a possibility that
you would go back to the space agency.
There was a rumor going around that NASA was nervous about risking John Glenn's life on another flight. He was a lot more useful as a living hero than as a dead martyr. So they offered him a desk job.
For me to stick around being the world's oldest permanent training used second-hand astronaut, whatever, I didn't want to really do that.
The man who hurtled to fame as the first American to orbit the Earth tosses his space helmet into the ring as a political candidate. Lieutenant Colonel...
Now Gus Grissom would fly the first Gemini. Gus took John Young with him, the first of the rookies to fly in space. Gemini was a sports car compared to Mercury.
Roger pitch. You're on your way, Molly Brown.
Everything worked great. The Gemini program was off to a beautiful start. And then the Russians walked.
At 8:30 Greenwich Mean Time, the second class Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Leonov left the spaceship. He was wearing a special spacesuit.
They were first in space, first to orbit, first woman in space, and all of a sudden here's another first for the Russian program.
Every time we stepped forward, it seemed like they were taking 2 steps.
Even in our most ambitious plans, we hadn't thought of sending a man outside for months. Now, that would have to change. The Russian spacewalk was their most impressive first since Sputnik. We had to respond on our next flight, Gemini 4, months ahead of schedule. We did. Space is the enemy of life. No air, full of radiation. In shade, you'd freeze to death. In direct sun, you'd burn up. For years, everything we did was designed to protect us from it. Now we were opening the hatch, and Ed White was putting his head right in the Dragon's mouth.
I'm under my own control.
We held our breath.
Okay.
So far, so good.
Okay, I'm coming over. It looks beautiful. I feel like $1 million. This is the greatest experience I've just remembered.
I think that once you get out and float, thinking that you're a couple hundred miles up in space and there's nothing below you except way below, and it's sort of a tranquil or lethargic experience that you sort of want to just enjoy it.
Right now I'm standing on my head, I'm looking right down, it looks like we're coming up on the coast of California.
Ed White's spacewalk was a triumph. Everyone was dazzled, and it seemed so easy. Scratch one obstacle on the way to the moon. 6 months later, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford tackled the next Gemini goal. Rendezvous with another vehicle. They were going to meet up with Gemini 7, flown by Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. It would test a critical step on the way to the moon. This was the kind of mission Wally loved. Pure precision flying with almost no science experiments.
You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, adios. On 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition.
Ignition. But no liftoff. It just sat there, and we waited for it to blow. Wally and Tom were left sitting on a ticking bomb, a mountain of high explosive fuel, just waiting for a spark.
Perfect countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Clock started, no liftoff. It was much more traumatic than that, of course. But it happened, the engines came up to speed, and it stopped. And but logic, this is all millisecond logic, said, hey, we haven't lifted off. If we had lifted off, and it started to shut down, our recourse was to eject out of there, and I would pull this ring between my legs, and it would eject both of us out from the spacecraft.
The statistics were that 75% of ejections were successful, and the definition of successful was that the guy didn't get killed.
Wally ignored the rules and followed his instinct. He didn't pull the escape ring. It was a gutsy move.
Full tanks are venting.
Okay, no problem on these tanks?
Negative.
Okay, we're just sitting here breathing.
Instinct. Man over machine. If that ejection system had been automatic, they'd have been blasted out of the spacecraft, wrecking it, the mission, and their bodies. Instead, 3 days later, Wally and Tom were back on their way, headed for Gemini 7. We were about to find out if our moon plan had a chance. It all depended on two vehicles meeting up in the vastness of space. If we couldn't rendezvous, we'd have to rethink our whole approach. They had to find each other, close in and hold formation, all at over 17,000 miles an hour.
Gemini 7 and 6, would you continue with the description of your station keeping?
Wally and Tom met up with Frank and Jim as if they'd done it 100 times before.
Right now, 6 is about 10 feet above and to the left of 7. We're just flying nose to nose, approximately 60 feet apart.
Yeah, we're sitting up here playing bridge together. We're in formation with 7. Everything is go here.
Roger, congratulations, excellent.
Precision flying at over 17,000 miles an hour. It was a long way from monkeys on automatic pilot. This was what we'd signed up for. Gemini 6 went home, leaving Frank Borman and Jim Lovell to take a crack at the next Gemini go. Duration. Could their bodies last a full 14 days in space? The length of a round-trip flight to the moon. The doctors worried about their bodies. I worried about their sanity. Two test pilot egos locked for 2 weeks in a space the size of a phone booth.
Well, nobody ever really slept because the activity of the other person would continually wake up the person that was trying to sleep.
It was the beginning of a beautiful relationship.
14 days in a Gemini spacecraft is a very, very trying experience.
Being 14 days with Frank Borman any place was wild, so.
I think Jim Lovell brought Mark Twain's Roughing It, which was apropos. But I don't believe we read it much.
There was a song that was sung by Nat King Cole. And I'm trying to think of what the name of it was.
We sang it for 14 days. It's Put Your Sweet Lips a Little Closer to the Phone, Nat King Cole.
Put your sweet lips a little closer to the phone.
Put your sweet
Let's
lips a little closer to the phone. Let's pretend that we're together all alone.
That went on for 2 weeks. And of course, Borman and I were alone.
See, I'd forgotten all about that. You're exactly right.
Frank and Jim were guinea pigs. The doctors were taking bets on what would happen when they landed. Odds were they'd be in pretty bad shape. Some thought they might not survive.
I remember when we were back on Earth, I looked at Lovell, and Lovell looked at me, and we said, well, I said, you going to pass out? And he said, no, and we were fine.
Yeah, well, we held hands and said we want to tell the world that we're engaged. I actually had to command my legs, left, right, as I walked across the carrier deck. My wife took a look at the movies, and she said it looked to me like I had my pants full, as I was leaned over and just, trudging along like a little boy would do with his pants full.
So much for medical fears. Now we knew man wouldn't be the weak link going to the moon. Gemini was on a roll, cracking a new problem every 3 months. Next up was docking, physically joining two spacecraft together.
Hello, Houston, this is Gemini 8. We're station keeping on the Agena at about 150 feet.
Gemini 8 would dock with an unmanned Agena booster.
Boy, look at that. Man, that's great. Man, that is really slick.
Commander was a young civilian named Neil Armstrong. He'd had a pilot's license since he was 16, flew fighters in Korea, and tested X-15s at Edwards.
Okay, Gemini 8, we have TM solid. You're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and flight, we are down. Oh, roger. Hey, congratulations. This is real good.
Then, without warning, they started spinning out of control. They were going faster than the whirligig at the county fair. Neil undocked and pulled back. But that only made it worse. Much worse.
We got serious problems here. We're toppling end over end, but we're disengaged from the Agena.
A thruster was stuck. They were doing a somersault every second and getting faster all the time. At this rate, they'd pass out. And that'd be all she wrote. As a last resort, Neil fired his re-entry thrusters. It worked. Now they had to get down immediately. 5,000 miles off course and in the wrong ocean, but they were safe. Spacewalking, rendezvous, long duration, docking. We'd tried out everything we'd need to reach the moon, and we still had 4 Gemini missions left. The moon was looking closer all the time.
Astronauts Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan are suited up, ready to go.
We would use the last Gemini flights to practice the one minor detail left, working in space. Ed White had made it look easy, but all he did was float around. Now Gene Cernan would try a few simple jobs. Open valves, tighten fittings, just to prove when we got to the moon we could work there.
There's even time for a joke with a giant match, an obvious sign of a relaxed, confident pre-flight mood.
We were all sure it would be easy. We were all dead wrong.
Tom Stafford reports that Cernan is encountering some fogging up of the visor. They are keeping the...
When I would turn a valve, if I wasn't held in my position in some way or another, I'd turn the valve, and the valve was a little tough to turn. It would turn me back, and my body would float away, and you'd start tumbling, and you'd start rolling.
In zero gravity, Gene was having a wrestling match with himself. He was using all of his energy just to try to stay still. Never mind do any work.
Okay, he's fogging real bad. Perhaps he needs hardcore to keep the fogging down to the minimum.
I lost 13 pounds. That's an awful lot of weight. I ended up with 100% humidity in my suit, and my entire visor got completely fogged over.
And he was the killer out. It is far more difficult to run so in zero G than they did.
Gene was totally blinded by the visor. He was physically exhausted, near collapse, and getting back in that spacecraft was something no one else could do for him.
They said if something happened and the fella was hung up outside, that we were to not do anything rash, but we would have to eventually release him and close the hatch and bring the vehicle back.
There's no way Tom could have re-entered successfully had he been towing me behind him. First of all, I would have burned up and been killed during re-entry, so what's the use of going through that? Second of all, he probably would have burned up himself. He would not have been able to close the hatch, and so instead of losing one manual, we would have lost 2.
Blinded, almost passing out, Gino finally made it back inside. We were starting to realize there was a lot about working in space we just didn't understand.
Yeah, let's just sit down and take a rest.
When Dick Gordon tried it on Gemini 11, he just about lost it too.
How you doing? Tired, Pete. All right, just rest.
Working in space was looking like the showstopper. We had guys exhausting themselves almost into unconsciousness. If we couldn't get out and work, going to the moon would be nothing but a sightseeing trip. Obviously, we needed to rethink the problem. It was time for a new angle, a different take, a different kind of guy. A really different kind of guy.
I think I understood the importance of being gentle and delicate and in control of the momentum or the mass of the body during spacewalks. I think I understood that just intuitively. These things were natural to me. They obviously were not natural to the Navy people who were trying to do spacewalking. So their overconfident attitude got them into trouble.
Buzz was a mechanical genius. His IQ must be sky high.
He was the first PhD pilot in the program. PhDs always kind of had a certain shock value in the particularly among the Slaytons and the Shepards, who knew they were a hell of a lot smarter than all the PhDs in the world.
Buzz was our MIT scientist pilot. He was smart, he was inventive, and some thought he was arrogant as hell. He got tagged from the day he arrived.
Gus Grissom and I were part of an interview team for a new group of astronauts, and Buzz Aldrin came in to our interview just for Gus and me. And sport coat, shirt and tie, and around his tie is this little chain thing. Hanging from the chain are Air Force wings. Below it, a Phi Beta Kappa gate. Gus looks up and said, "Aldrin, we've already read your resume. Why the hell are you wearing it?"
Buzz was absolutely certain he could do it better, way better. He threw out the pulley system we'd been using for training. Then he threw a space capsule in a swimming pool and went in after it. Right before our eyes, he invented the art of working in space. Buzz got together tools like he was fixing to climb Mount Everest. Footholds, handholds, Velcro grips, bungee cords. By the time he was ready to go, he looked like Mr. Goodwrench.
Now the electrical connector. But no waste feathers.
Buzz was like a human fly, working out there for hours and having a ball. He made it look easy. For him, it was.
Gemini 12, Houston Capcom, 1 minute to LOS. New EVA record, beautiful job.
Say what you want about Buzz Aldrin, but be sure to add the word successful. He succeeded where everyone else failed and put us back on track toward the moon. The Gemini program was an unqualified success. It was on to Apollo.
In Mercury and Gemini, a total of 26 astronauts have logged a total of 1,900 hours in space, covering 35 million miles.
Gemini has demonstrated the feasibility of almost everything we plan to do in Apollo.
Gentlemen, the Gemini program is now officially completed.
In the 5.5 years since Al Shepard's flight, we'd come a long way. We hadn't heard from the Russians in a while. For all we knew, we were ahead. We'd learned a few lessons the hard way, paid some dues. The moon now seemed so close we felt like we could touch it. But we'd soon find out, on our first attempt, we'd almost push it away forever.